And good evening and welcome again to Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Schieffer, and today we'll talk about the status of health care reform. Do even those voting on it in the Senate really know what is in this legislation and what it's all about? Then we're going to talk about global warming. We'll talk about the island nation of the Maldives, which may wind up literally underwater. But first to that health care situation, and for that we call in our expert, Mike Allen of Politico. Mike, what is the status of this thing? We hear this, there's no public option, but there's some public option. We hear about agreements and compromises. I'm not sure I know what's going on right now.
Well, Bob, you make a great point. Never has Washington talked so much about something that very few people have seen and no one understands. Now, the reason that we haven't seen it is Senate Democratic leaders don't want to show their cards to say exactly what's in it, because then the Congressional Budget Office, which through its score for this will determine whether or not it's going to play with moderates and conservatives. Once it's talked about in public, they'll put all their information out before there's time to negotiate and tweak. So there's this parlor game going on. But the important thing to know is that this compromise makes it more likely that the Senate will in fact be able to get their part of healthcare done by Christmas. It was looking very shaky. The fact that they've pulled this together looks like it may well happen, and they have an idea for speeding this up. Rather than having the usual drawn-out conference process where House and Senate try and agree on the differences between their bills, they're having something that they call ping, pong, ping. It's the game of the year here in Washington, and that means that the Senate is going to send their bill over to the House, ping. The House will make a few changes, pong, they'll send it back to the Senate, which will approve it and send it ping to the president's desk. Good luck.
Well, I just want to read you something that was in the New York Times on Wednesday. This was the lead story in the New York Times, and I'm not making fun of the New York Times when I read this because I think it accurately reflects just what you're saying. But here is the lead they put on their story about health care. It says, Senate Democrats said on Wednesday that they were not sure exactly what was in a deal that the majority leader said would surmount a disagreement over a proposed government health plan. But they voiced guarded optimism that it would ultimately help them pass major health care legislation. I mean,
I love that you picked up on that. It could be The Onion, right? A parody of a Washington policy story. But see, that gives them a lot of running room, right? The fact that they haven't shown their cards means that they still can make a few backroom deals to get to a 60.
Let me just ask you this, Mike. What is it that is supposed to be the substitute for the public option that now the leadership has clearly realized they don't have the votes to pass?
Right.
But it's something that sort of sounds like a public option, or is it?
No, you're right. It would allow people who do not currently qualify for Medicare because we're not old enough or having to do with income to buy into it. And the talking point for this, what Congress wants you to say, is that this is the same health care plan the members of Congress have, which is somewhat true but not completely true. This would create less of a bureaucracy than the public plan would, but it would expand the bureaucracy we have now. We're talking heads of a pin here, Bob.
Well, you know, I remember a couple of months ago, I asked John McCain the very thing that we're talking about, and I said, are they going to pass health care reform? He said they're going to pass something, but I don't know what that something is. I think that's where we are.
And they're not going to know, and they're not going to know what it is either. That's what's very frustrating about this, is it's going to be very unclear to Americans what they just got. Yes, President Obama will get a big bump in polls when this gets passed, but I think he needs to worry about disappointment as people come to find out what's in it and what's not. As you know, Bob, a lot of it doesn't kick in till later, and what nobody will say on camera and is just a fact is the guts of this healthcare program is you're taxing middle-class people to expand healthcare access for people who don't have it. And that may be a great idea, but it's very difficult to sell politically.
There you go, and that's it, and that is the bottom line. Mike Allen, you're always up on these things. You know more about this than I do, but I find some reassurance in the fact that you don't really understand all of it either.
Scratching our heads with you.
we'll wait and we'll watch here and try to keep reporting on it. Mike Allen of Politico, thank you so much.
Happy weekend.
Thank you. We want to turn next to the president's coming trip to Copenhagen and the big conference on climate change. You know, you can talk about an issue, you can write about an issue, but one of the things that television and now the web can do is really show us an issue. And Mark Phillips, who's in our London bureau with us today, has really been doing that this week on the CBS Evening News. He has done some terrific pieces showing what global warming can do. We want to go first to the Maldives Islands where he was, and we're going to show you just a part of the piece that he did there. The Maldives, of course, are off the coast of India, and show what global warming may do to that island nation.
Even the least bad scenario for sea level rise would have the place looking like this. Worst predictions would have the place looking like this, or worst of all, like this. Which is why President Nasheed decided to make as big a splash as possible to publicize the threat. He held a cabinet meeting underwater.
Well, that's the bottom line, isn't it? Underwater. That's where we will end up. In many senses, that might be where we might be having our cabinet meetings in the future.
So you were practicing.
So this is a little bit of what you may be having to experience in the future.
The Maldives.
So there you go. Mark has obviously surfaced now, and here to tell us about this piece.
And dried off. Yeah.
Mark, it was a fine piece. You also did one, you went to Greenland and showed the other side of all this. But what kind of a time frame are we talking about? Obviously, this is a country that's, 7 feet above sea level. So they're going to be the first to know if global warming does cause the oceans to rise.
Well, that's exactly the issue there. There's no high ground to run to in the Maldives. 7 feet is the highest point. 80% of the land which is split up into almost 2,000 little islands spread over 600 miles of sea. But what land there is, 80% of it is at 3 feet or less above sea level. They're just...
So there you go. Mark has obviously surfaced now, and here to tell us about this piece.
And dried off. Yeah.
Mark, it was a fine piece. You also did one, you went to Greenland and showed the other side of all this. But what kind of a time frame are we talking about? Obviously, this is a country that's, 7 feet above sea level. So they're going to be the first to know if global warming does cause the oceans to rise.
Well, that's exactly the issue there. There's no high ground to run to in the Maldives. 7 feet is the highest point. 80% of the land which is split up into almost 2,000 little islands spread over 600 miles of sea. But what land there is, 80% of it is at 3 feet or less above sea level. They're just little, very pretty coral islands that shift around in the currents, that kind of thing. So if the scientific predictions turn out to be true, and of course the last major international amalgam of scientists' predictions through the UN's International Climate Control Panel predicted a sea rise of as much as about 2 feet this century. Subsequent studies have shown potential sea rises a lot higher than that. It effectively means, as President Nasheed explained to us, that the place just doesn't become viable, and somewhere close to 400,000 people have to look for a new place to live.
So, I mean, and you're talking about soon, because, I mean, this could affect some of the next generation there.
Well, there's some dispute in the science, but some of the more recent studies talk about the sea level rise happening even quicker than had been predicted, even perhaps in the next 2 or 3 decades. According to Nasheed, there's a window now of about 6 or 7 years in which decisions can be taken to reduce the amount of carbon in the form mostly of carbon dioxide that's being pumped into the atmosphere, and allowing for the lags and all the other scientific hoo-ha around that. That's the window that the population of the Earth has, basically, to make decisions to try to preserve the future. And as you say, if that doesn't happen, then the Maldives become probably the first place to go.
Now, you had another very fine piece about Greenland, where I guess you could say there is some kind of an upside for the folks in Greenland about global warming, because if if it gets warmer in Greenland, there's going to be more land there that they can cultivate.
Yeah, but buy the beachfront property. It's no, there are some potential benefits because it opens up area for exploitation, and we already know that there are significant mineral deposits there. Mining companies are falling over each other to get licenses to do the exploratory work to see if these deposits are viable. There are good indications of pretty substantial oil reserves offshore as well that become accessible because the sea lanes are open for most of the year and that kind of thing. The Greenlanders will tell you that it potentially creates some problems for them too because a lot of their structure, their basic infrastructure is built for an Arctic environment on permafrost. If that starts to melt, they've got to start doing a lot of reconstruction as well. So it's not a cost-free proposition for them, but it does open up some economic possibilities. The question beyond that, of course, is who do they sell to? Yeah. What kind of economies are still functioning and what kind of way to constitute a market for them. And they say with a bit of a wink as well, there's always the opening of the Northwest Passage. We'll just ship it straight to China.
There you go.
So who's to say they're wrong?
All right, Mark Phillips. Well, two very good pieces.
Thank
I
you.
mean, those were real television pieces and the kind we're all proud of and show what television can do. Mark Phillips from our London Bureau. That's it for Washington Unplugged. Be sure to watch us on Face the Nation Sunday on television when we'll talk about health care with Senators Joe Lieberman, Jay Rockefeller, Ben Nelson, and Mitch McConnell. That's it for Washington Unplugged.